And oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Welcome to United Astronomy Clubs of New Jersey. We're once again back on site in Jenny Jump State Forest at the observatory here. It's a bit of a rainy, cloudy night. Shout out to everyone we saw at NEAF today. We have been at NEAF. We have a booth set up along with some of our member clubs there, so you can always, if you happen to be going to NEAF, do come and say hi to us tomorrow for the last day. Now, we do have the program. As always, do check us out on our website, uacnj.org. That's where you're going to find a list of all our member clubs, all our upcoming talks and events. And it's also going to give you fun information about what type of telescopes we have, as well as any science we have going on at the time. Now, for the people who are here, we have the porta potties to the back. We have the gift shop and museum area you can check out. For the people everywhere, also check us out on our socials, our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have a Discord channel, and also we do live stream these on YouTube and Twitch. So do hit those like and subscribe buttons because it lets us know that we're doing a good job so we can continue offering you that free public programs. Tonight's talk is So You Want to Buy a Telescope with Daniel Kirby. Dan has a bachelor's degree in physics and a master's in computer science. He has been an amateur astronomer since his childhood, and he has joined AAA or AAA in 2021 and UACNJ, which is us, in 2022. He has spent many a lonely night here at Jenny Jump wandering between the stars and being very cold in the wintertime. While astronomy is by far Daniel's most passionate hobby, he also enjoys reading, cycling, writing, self-balancing personal electrical vehicles. Segway? Oh, that's far more balance than I have.
One wheel.
And yep, your
Uh,
mic should be on.
All right. Hello, everyone. Yeah. So, as stated, the title of my talk is "So You Want to Buy a Telescope." So we're going to be talking about some basics of telescopes, but first, and recommendations on what to look for in your first scope. So a little bit about me. I'm a lifelong astronomy hobbyist. No longer teenage. This newspaper clipping is from 2006. And I think I look just about as good as I did when I was 15. Um, as was said, I have a degree in physics and a degree in computer science. I'm a software engineer by trade, and I started getting into collecting my own telescopes during the pandemic. So I have a lot of recent experience with, what products are out there right now. So a little bit about you, the audience. So first of all, the intended audience of this talk is people who are interested in astronomy, but maybe are not so sure about much other than that they want to get their own telescope, and you're making the right decision. This is a great hobby. You are going to meet a lot of really cool people doing astronomy, and you can have a lot of really great experiences. And unlike some other hobbies, if you find yourself wanting to get out of this hobby, you can usually sell your gear for about as much as you paid for it. Like I like the comparison to boating because they say the best 2 days in a boat owner's life are the day they buy the boat and the day they sell the boat, because you got all those costs in between, maintenance and whatnot. We don't really have that. So a little bit about this talk. So we're going to go over some basics about telescopes. I'm going to talk about the major types of telescopes that are commercially available and popular. I'm going to make some specific product recommendations for those different types. And we're going to talk about some accessories that you might be interested in and some miscellanea. A little bit about the expectations for what you're going to see getting into the hobby and some additional tips. But before we get started, our mantra for tonight is going to be the best telescope is the one that gets used. Say it with me now. The best telescope is the one that gets used. All right. So the first thing I wanna cover is a bit of a common misconception. That is why are we doing this? Why do we use telescopes to look up at the night sky? And the your eyeballs are pretty good. But yeah, so we often people assume that we use telescopes because of the property of magnification, because we want to make the image larger. And this is true. This is something that is very helpful, but it may surprise you to find out that a lot of astronomical objects are quite large in the visual sense. So, for instance, this picture is not a possible picture. This cannot be taken because this is the moon and this is the Andromeda galaxy. It is photoshopped because the moon never gets that close to Andromeda in the sky. But this is here by way of comparing the sizes. So even though you've seen the full moon, basically every once a month your whole life, it turns out that Andromeda is actually a little bit larger on the sky. So we do use magnification in astronomical telescopes. We usually top out maybe at something like 75x, 100x. We're not really, unless you're looking for some really, really small objects, you're really not going really hard on magnification. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the top line numbers to expect when you're shopping for a telescope. So let's suppose you were shopping for a car. What would you want to know about it? What are some things you'd want to know? Yeah, well, yeah, I kind of seeded the pot there with using the having the EPA sticker on the right. But yeah, maybe you want to know your miles per gallon. Maybe you want to know something like 0 to 60. At least I would want to know my 0 to 60 acceleration, and maybe you want to know range. How far am I going to get to drive this thing before I have to fill it up again? So for telescopes, I'm going to want you to focus on three specs. These are not the only three that we could talk about, but I think these are really a really good set for a beginner to be learning about. Number one is aperture, which we'll get into. The number two is focal length, and number three is limiting magnitude. So first, let's start with aperture. So aperture is the size of what we call the objective. So for a reflector, that would be the mirror. For a refractor, that would be the lens. And if you learn nothing else from this talk other than the best telescope is the one that gets used, it should be that the most important number about a telescope is its aperture. So when you have more aperture, you get more light, and that's what you want, because objects in the sky are quite dim, and we want to collect as much light as possible. Typical consumer beginner telescopes are going to be between 3 inches, maybe a little bit lower than 3 inches, and about 8 inches in aperture. So focal length. Focal length is the distance that the optical train, which is the path of the light through the telescope, travels between the aperture and your eyepiece. Longer focal lengths will lend themselves to more magnification, which will help you with smaller objects. Now, by smaller objects here, I mean visually smaller. So, like, for instance, the planet Mars is quite large, bigger than the moon, but, in the sky, it's actually much, much smaller because it's farther away. So your magnification is based on the ratio between the telescope focal length and the eyepiece focal length. So a 2,000 millimeter telescope with a 20 millimeter eyepiece is 100x power. So when you want to change magnifications, you're going to change eyepieces. Typical consumer beginner telescopes are going to be between 400 millimeters and 2,000 millimeters. Don't ask me why we do aperture in inches and we do focal length in millimeters. I can't explain that. In Europe, they do both in millimeters, but we live in America. And now I'm going to talk about limiting magnitude. So magnitude is a logarithmic scale that measures the brightness of objects in the sky. So we actually got magnitude from the ancient Greeks. What they did was they classified stars into magnitude 1 for the brightest stars, down to magnitude 6 for the dimmest stars. They didn't have telescopes, so they didn't know there were any stars that were too dim to be seen with the naked eye. So magnitude 6 is about the limit of naked eye vision, though some people claim they can see a little bit dimmer, some people are a little bit brighter. And generally the brightest stars are around magnitude 1. And obviously, since the higher numbers mean a dimmer object, that means that we can have negative numbers. So Venus is like about -4, the full moon is like -12, the sun is even brighter than that. And as I said, it's a logarithmic scale, so that means that one jump in magnitude is not, it's a 2.5x. And you can look at some catalogs of deep sky objects that you might be interested in viewing and compare that to the advertised magnitude of your telescope. But you have to put this in brackets. Just like, a car manufacturer is going to tell you the 0 to 60 in ideal conditions, the gas mileage in ideal conditions, telescope manufacturers do the same thing. A typical consumer beginner telescope will have a limiting magnitude between 12 and 14. I find that here at Jenny Jump, most of my telescopes kind of max out around 10, maybe even a little bit brighter than that. So that's something you want to be aware of, but it is a number you can use to compare telescopes. So now we're going to go over the major types of consumer telescopes. This is not an exhaustive list of all the telescopes that are on the types of telescopes that have ever been made, but these are the most popular ones that you're usually going to see beginners or even experienced astronomers using. So we have refractors, we have reflectors, and we have catadioptric telescopes, or CATs, which they will be referred to for the rest of this talk because I don't want to keep saying catadioptric. So refractors. This is probably what you imagine when you imagine a telescope. It's a typical sort of pirate spyglass device. It's got a lens or an objective lens at one end, and it has a eyepiece at the back. I'm going to talk a little bit about achromats versus apochromats on the next slide, but some advantages to the refractor. They're fairly easy to use. There's basically no maintenance for most refractors. Lens optics will offer a little bit of a higher contrast view, which is popular for people who like looking at nebulas, since those are benefit from higher contrast views. We call that refractor magic. Some disadvantages: your price you're paying on a refractor per unit aperture will get high as you go up in aperture. Um, Glass is heavy, so when you make a bigger refractor, you're making a much heavier telescope. And you can also get some dew accumulation on the lens. Many people up here will tell you that a dewy night can be a night where you're going home early. So that's something that, every telescope is vulnerable to that, but since refractors have the lens out front, they can be a little bit of a problem, and they experience chromatic aberration. So what's chromatic aberration? So I'm going to talk about that relative to the apochromats versus achromats. So if you remember, your high school physics class, you learned about Isaac Newton. You learned about how he put a prism up against the window and split the sunlight into all the different colors. And that's very pretty, but we don't want that happening in our telescopes. So what an achromat does is it uses a second optical element to rejoin some of the wavelengths of light, but particularly the green is kind of left out, and it winds up not being at the focal point. So if you use an achromatic telescope, which is I would recommend for a beginner to buy if you're looking at a refractor, you will get a little bit of a purple halo since you're basically seeing all the color except for the green. Apochromats will add a third optical element, and some really high-end ones I've heard manage to do this in 2 optical elements, which is better for your light transmission, but that will rejoin the green. I would not recommend an apo for a beginner. I would say that generally those are rather costly, and they're mostly the people who use them are either very picky or they're doing imaging where it really matters to get accurate colors. So now I'm going to talk about reflectors. So they're probably the most popular amateur telescope design that you can buy. The reflector was invented by Isaac Newton, so we call it a Newtonian reflector. You can also get what's called a Dobsonian reflector. And what's the difference? There is no optical difference between Newtonian and Dobsonian. So this telescope I have on the left here, that's a Newtonian on an equatorial mount. And the one on the right is a Dobsonian, and what defines a Dobsonian is this, what we call this rocker box, which is what it's mounted on. So Dobsonians were popularized by John Dobson. He was an amateur astronomer from San Francisco, and basically the idea was that it was a good way to make sort of low cost beginner scopes that could easily be gotten out to people, and they have a bit of reputation for sort of being for the best value for the price. One of the advantages, you get a good amount of aperture per unit cost. As I alluded to, On the previous slide, mirrors are going to be a little bit less vulnerable to do since they're sort of at the back of the telescope. If you get a Dobsonian, you're not going to need a costly mount. You're just getting sort of this two pieces of wood and whatever bearings they have. And mirrors don't actually experience chromatic aberration at all. They can experience spherical aberration, but that's sort of another matter, and we can talk about that relative to other scopes that can kind of address it. So spherical aberration is when you have like a little bit of sort of a 3D effect of like a bulbous kind of feeling, when you get like the coma around the outside of the image. Some disadvantages of reflectors: you're going to get less contrast than a refractor of the same aperture. You could get some dust on the mirror since it's an open system, and you might require collimation after a while. So what's collimation? So sometimes part of your optical train will wind up being misaligned, and this causes some suboptimal views. It happens mostly to refractors. I guess in theory it could happen, or is it mostly to reflectors? In theory, I suppose it could happen to a refractor, but I've never heard of someone having to collimate one unless it was really old. And usually, after you've been on a few rocky road trips, you're going to want to check on the collimation of your Newtonian. But if you're just getting started, you had it for less than a year, I wouldn't worry too much about this. And it's actually not that hard to get your mirror aligned correctly. There are different ways to do it. This guide here on the right is for doing it by eyeball. With a collimation lens that has these crosshairs on it. You can get lasers to do it. There's all manner. You can even use a star. So there's a bunch of ways to do it, and it tends to not be as bad as some people make it out to be. All right, so now we're going to talk about CATs, also called compound telescopes, also called Cassegrain telescopes. So they're sort of a combination between a reflector and a refractor. And because of that, they have many of the advantages and disadvantages of both. So a CAT has this optical train that goes through a correcting plate, which is a lens. It goes to the back of the telescope where it meets the mirror, and that reflects the light to a secondary mirror that is in the middle of the lens, and then reflects it back out to the eyepiece. So why are we doing this? Why are we sending light, through the telescope basically 3 times? Well, this allows us to have a much longer focal length in the same size telescope. So an advantage there, you can have a compact size, and you get these sort of stubby tubes, and that lends it to these telescopes to be incorporating all manner of electronic gizmos. These were some of the first telescopes to have computer control. I would describe a CAT as kind of a bit of an all-rounder telescope. They're kind of good at a lot of things, but not great at any one thing. A few unique disadvantages. They are costlier than a reflector of comparable aperture, and the flip side being all rounders, you're kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. And this complex optical train makes it, in my opinion, a little bit more difficult to collimate than a Newtonian. The way that my catadioptric scope, the way I usually collimate it is using a star, which is something that cuts into time I could be observing, and I can't do it during daylight. There's other methods you can use what they call the Hall of Mirrors, where you do it by eyeball. And there are ways to do it with lasers, but since you have this really complicated optical train, it can be really difficult to get those aligned properly. All right, so which telescope should I choose for my first? So now we're going to go through some specific product recommendations. These are things that are mostly available now, although the supply chain issues with COVID, some of these you might find them out of stock. Most of these scopes that I list have similar alternatives from other manufacturers, and I'm not getting paid for any of this, so I'm a customer just like you. So I'm going to start with the Orion Short Tube 80. You can buy this telescope and I did a price check on these before about a week ago, so these should be more or less up-to-date prices. During the pandemic, a lot of telescope prices went up a lot, and now we're starting to see some of them come back down a little bit. So I don't ask me how that works, but so you can get the Short Tube 80 for $180 with no mount. It's an 80 millimeter aperture, about pi inches. It's 400 millimeters focal length, very short focal length, and its limiting magnitude is 12.2. So this is a classic beginner refractor. I grew up with one of these. Many people have had these as their first telescope, including people here at Jenny Jump. Um, you can get it in the 80A and 80T variant for astronomical and terrestrial viewing. So the only difference between the 80A and the 80T is in this diagonal here at the back of the telescope. In the A variant, you get a mirror. In the T variant, you get a prism. So having a prism means that it will make sure the image is the right way up. Now, astronomers don't actually care about whether things are the right way up because there's actually no up and down in space. But if you're using it for bird watching or sightseeing or something, you might want to use this. I'm the only person I know who does this, but I love to use erect image prisms for when I look at the moon because I like for the moon in the telescope to look the same more or less as it does to the naked eye. So you might enjoy getting the T variant if you want to do a lot of moon observing. You can use this telescope on a camera tripod, though I wouldn't recommend that if you're going to get serious in the hobby because camera tripods generally are not designed to look directly up. You can also use it on a Vixen compatible mount, which is more or less the standard telescope mount these days. You can easily find this scope for cheaper used and sometimes even new with some accessories thrown in by Orion or by whoever's selling it to you. This is an appropriate first telescope for a child, and there's no reason an adult can't have fun with it. So now I'm going to talk about the Orion Star Blast 4.5. So it's a little pricier. It retails for $279. It is a 4.5-inch tabletop reflector. I think it's come down a little bit from that in price. 450 millimeter focal length, sort of similar short focal length, and the limiting magnitude of it is 12.9. So one thing I really like about this telescope is it's built for a tabletop use, so you don't need to get a mount for it. You can kind of just plop it on a picnic table or park bench. You can put like it on a tub or something. This aperture now at 4.5 inches, you're starting to get big enough to do some deep sky objects. And it also has a Vixen compatible plate. At least not the version in the picture doesn't, but more recent ones have the Vixen plate. So cool thing about a Vixen compatible plate is that means that the telescope can grow with your collection. If you get other mounts, other telescopes that also have Vixen plates, you can mix and match. You can put one telescope on one mount from another, and you can find other uses for it. If you've upgraded to a bigger telescope, you can use this one for outreach or for other events. And this is another one that's appropriate for a child or an adult. All right, so now I'm going to get into what I think is probably the best recommendation telescope of the bunch here. This is the Orion XT6 and XT8 Dobsonians. So these retail for $500 or $650, and they usually throw in a bunch of extras with that. That's a 6-inch aperture, 8-inch aperture, 1200 millimeter focal length, so you got a little bit more magnification to work with there, and their limiting magnitude is listed as 13.4 and 14 for the 8-inch. Very simple to easy to use Dobsonian. This is a telescope that can easily become your favorite, easily used by an adult of any height. It might be a little on the tall side for a child. It's kind of about this tall, and for those on the live stream, when I say this tall, I'm holding my hand about this high above the ground. Now, so you might be wondering, okay, so, it's a well-priced Dobsonian. Which of these should I get? Should I get the 6 or should I get the 8? I tend to lean toward the 8, and the reason for that is, at least the way that they're usually appointed nowadays, is the 8 will come with a more robust focuser, which can accommodate larger eyepieces. So that, I think, I don't think you should run out and buy a bunch of new eyepieces when you're just starting, but as you grow in the hobby and grow your collection, you might want to get bigger eyepieces, which you can still use with this telescope. I will warn you not to supersize to the 10-inch version of this telescope. I'm already kind of supersizing you a little bit to the 8. Historically, people usually recommended the 6. And once you get a telescope that's kind of too big, kind of starts, and too heavy, that starts to run afoul of our mantra of that the best telescope is the one that gets used. There are lots of alternatives for this particular style of telescope to Orion. They're more or less the brand that just popularized this one. So you can definitely look elsewhere for other 6 and 8-inch Dobbs, and they're pretty much all recommended. I don't think I've ever heard of any of them that's really bad. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Celestron's line of Schmidt-Cassegrain's telescopes. In case you thought this was an Orion commercial, so this is their signature line of orange tube scopes. They introduced their 8-inch SCT in 1970, which means that Celestron has been making these telescopes for about as long as Ford has been making the Mustang. As you can see on the right here, they're endorsed by Mr. Spock, so you can use them to explore strange new worlds and seek out new life and all that. These are on the pricier side for a beginner. I actually don't think that one of these should be your first telescope, but I'm including them in the talk so you get an idea of what's out there. And so we'll start with the Nexstar SE line. This is the classic orange tube. They have a 4-inch, a 5-inch, a 6-inch, and an 8-inch. These are motorized telescopes that have computer-controlled go-to capability. These all require electricity. They can run off of AA batteries. You can buy a battery from Celestron, and you can. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the bottom of the slide. To use the go-to function, you need the current time and date. You need your GPS coordinates, and you need at least one object in the sky. I would recommend trying to give the computer at least 2 objects, and I tend to try to put them at like a 90-degree angle, so it can kind of get sort of that Cartesian coordinates. Go-to will typically get the object in the eyepiece, though it might not be centered, and it also might be a little bit, out to the left or right, top or bottom. So it's not magic. It's a computer, and computers have glitchy behavior. So of these, I recommend the 6-inch, which retails for $1,099 without batteries. As I mentioned before, is a 1500 millimeter focal length and a limiting magnitude of 13.4. So that's basically the same as a 6-inch Dobsonian. The battery options. So you can buy a battery from Celestron. You can plug it into the wall. You can use AA's, but it'll burn through those really quickly. And you can get your car. You can use your car battery. And if you're into camping, you can get like a deep cycle marine battery, and you can run these for days on end, and maybe even run some other camping equipment along with it, like your camp kitchen or whatever other stuff you have. So now I'm going to talk about the Nexstar Evolution line, which is the sort of up-badged Nexstar SE. They make them in a 6-inch, an 8-inch, and a 9.25. So these two, the 6 and 8, are optically equivalent to the Nexstar SEs in the same aperture. So they just come with a sturdier mount with an internal battery, and they have a different paint job. They're gray instead of orange. The 9.25 is obviously unique. So a cool thing about the Evolution is that you can operate the mount manually. You can unlock the clutches, and so if your battery dies, you can push the thing around at 2,000 millimeters. These I actually recommend the 8-inch. I find that with this more robust mount, you can get a little bit more aperture, and without it getting too wobbly. It retails for $2,199 as 2,032 millimeter focal length and a limiting magnitude of 14. So basically equivalent to an 8-inch Dobsonian. Is the view going to be equivalent to a 6 or 8-inch Dobsonian from these two? I would say yes, at least as far as a beginner can see. I've looked through all the 6-inch SCTs, 6-inch Dobbs, 8 inches of both. And I have found that it generally more or less looks the same. The slightly different optical train can make the image look a little bit different. So, but I don't know if I have sensitive enough eyes to tell the difference. So now I'm going to talk about Celestron's other new product, which is their StarSense Explorer line. So this line of telescopes uses a second flat mirror that is aligned with the optical axis of the telescope to use your smartphone to do what is called plate matching. So plate matching is when if you're familiar with facial recognition, is basically sort of like that, but for astronomy. So the camera of your smartphone takes a picture, and it looks at whatever area of the sky that you're looking at, and it says, "Oh, I think I'm looking at this, this particular star, this particular area of stars." So this gives you push to behavior, but which is like go to, but there's no motors. You're the motor, and you have to push it around, and it'll tell you to go, up, left, right, whatever. I would argue that in some ways this is a little bit more convenient than a computerized go-to system. If you're in this hobby for long enough, you will eventually have an experience where you have a list of objects you want to look at, and it's 2 in the morning, and you realize, oh no, that thing's behind a tree. I have to pick up my telescope and carry it across the field. With the StarSense Explorer, you can do that, and you won't lose your alignment. The computer is not going to need to be reset. It'll just take a look at the star field and figure out what it's looking at. A few downsides to this design. You'll be looking at your phone's screen a lot while you're stargazing, which will harm your night vision. You're going to need a power bank because this thing's going to drain your phone's battery like crazy. And I have noticed, because I've seen these telescopes in person, I have noticed that the build quality on them is a little bit lesser than the equivalent Celestron telescope that is not a StarSense. And additionally, I've also noticed that people who have these, as they, get into the hobby and get better at finding stuff, they tend to stop using the StarSense and tend to just start using it as a regular telescope. This is the Explorer DX. It's a 5-inch. It retails for just under $500. More recently, they've been coming out with Dobsonians that work this way, and I think they are generally about $150 to $200 extra on top of what you would be paying for the Orion Dob or any other equivalent. Anyways, now let's remember our mantra. The best telescope is the one that gets used. Okay, so what other things do I need to get started in the hobby? So a few things that I think you should buy. Field guides. Now, I think we're sort of used to, in our modern era, expecting that anything we want to learn is going to be on YouTube, and we can just, pick it up from videos. But I tend to think that astronomy is still kind of a hobby that you benefit from getting stuff that's in a book. My two favorite field guides are Turn Left at Orion and the Year-Round Messier Marathon Field Guide. So let me talk a little bit about what you're getting if you buy these two books. Both of them contain early section or beginning sections about how to use a telescope, basic idea, theory of astronomy. Kind of a lot of the stuff I've gone through here, but with a lot more time to digest it. And then the second half of both of these books is going to be sort of a mission. It's going to be a list of, objects that you can look at and see with the telescope you just learned how to use. An honorable mention I'll give here to Night Watch by Terrence Dickinson. I think this is a really good book. I think it is very comprehensive, has a lot of information about amateur astronomy, but I think it can be a little bit too much, and I find that this book is kind of a bit more like drinking from a fire hose, and it's not really just the stuff you need to get started. Another thing you will probably want is a planisphere, which is this object over here on the bottom right. So this is a device that you spin it around and match the time and date on the outside, and it'll show you what is visible in the sky. These are usually set up for about 40 degrees north latitude, which is more or less where New York City is. I think we're at like 41. So it's generally the right latitude for most people in North America, or at least in the U.S. You probably will want a red flashlight because the white light of a flashlight can disrupt your night vision. And you will probably want a Telrad. I'm going to talk about that on another slide. And you will probably want to get a membership to your local astronomy club. That's going to come back. Yeah, so this is what the view looks like through a Telrad. So this is fairly foolproof, and I should know. So it's basically a bullseye projected as at infinity. This is called a reflex sight. If you ever played Call of Duty, you've probably seen one of these things. I actually, my wife knows basically nothing about astronomy. I gave her one of my telescopes and asked her to find Jupiter, and she got it, boom, right in the eyepiece using one of these Telrads. So I'm a real advocate for these. They usually retail for about $40 to $50, and they can pretty much work on any telescope. All right. So what about stuff that I shouldn't buy? So I would say don't buy any extra eyepieces. The eyepieces that came with your telescope should be fine. They came with your telescope for a reason. And give yourself some time to find out what other eyepieces you might like to upgrade to. And a lot of the time, if you are, in the hobby for a while, you're upgrading eyepieces, you're just going to buy ones that are similar to the ones that came with it, but are a little bit pricier and a little bit higher quality. Because, the focal length of the eyepiece that came with it is probably correct to use with that telescope. Filters. I have seen lots of filter kits that are basically junk that you're never going to use. You might want to get a polarizer, which is a filter you sort of spin it and it dims or brightens the image. That's really useful for the moon. But apart from that, unless you're doing photography, you're probably not going to want some filters just to get started. Astrophotography equipment. All right, so astronomy is really hard. Photography is also really hard. So you put them together, you have an even harder hobby. So I will bracket this. If you're coming into the astronomy with a lot of experience in photography and you're sort of just picking up the astronomy stuff as you go, then I think you can jump straight into astrophotography. Other than that, I would say wait at least a year until you've done a lot of visual observing and then get into it. But if you are interested in learning more about astrophotography, our member Mike D is giving a talk on this subject on June 17th. I have spent a lot of lonely nights up here, or not lonely because he was there, but like a lot of cold nights up here with Mike. He's a great guy, and he takes some really beautiful photos. Software. There are really awesome free software options for use in astronomy. I'm going to show you one right now. Is that going to work? Yeah, it did. This is Stellarium. This is the astronomy software I use most. This might not be obvious because this is actually a live view of what the sky would be if it weren't all cloudy and raining. But really cool little trick. You may recognize this location. This is Jenny Jump. This is our observatory, and this is a thing you can do with Stellarium. You can put in a panoramic image and Photoshop out the sky, and then it will sort of give you a chance to see, like, oh, what stuff is going to be behind the trees. So I use this a lot. I also have it on my phone, and you can use it to sort of find like where objects are going to be that you might be interested in looking at. And you can also do this like eyepiece simulation to see like, oh, this is what it's going to look like in your particular telescope. Yeah, so it'll give you the magnification and effective field of view. So you give it the information of like the focal length, the aperture. I don't even it actually needs the aperture, but like the focal length and the effective field of the apparent field of view of the eyepiece, and it'll give you like sort of a simulated view, so you can see like, hey, am I gonna fit this thing in the eyepiece, or like how much magnification am I gonna want to fit it in. And I would recommend not buying a collimation tool if you're just getting started. Like I said before, your telescope's factory collimation should be fine. It's after you've taken it on a few rocky road trips, that's when I would start to look into it. I just collimated my 6-inch Newtonian for the first time. I've had that telescope for a year, and it was not out by a lot. And that telescope has been on a lot of rocky road trips. All right, so wait, what if I have more money and I'm just addicted to shopping? What are some things in the maybe pile of things that you might want to buy? You might want to get a case for your telescope. You want to protect your investment. You might want to get a case for your eyepieces and what other accessories. You might want to get a good map or field guide to the moon if you're interested in doing lunar observations. And you might want to get some more detailed or paper star charts that you can use to plan ahead or while you're observing. You might want to get a green laser pointer. Those things are super fun. You basically have a lightsaber, and sometimes I find people are more interested in looking at the green laser pointer shining up at the sky than the stars. And you might want to get some Telrad specific finder charts. So in my previous image where I showed the view through a telrad, that was looking at an object that was clearly visible. I think that was the moon, right? But these finder charts, you might want to look at an object that's not visible to the naked eye. And what you can do is you can basically just say, oh, I got to put that star, like right next to the ring. And then, boom, it's going to be in the eyepiece. All right, so now a little bit about, what the heck am I even going to see with this thing? Like we talked all about all this gear and like what we're going to be using, what are we actually going to be using it to look at? So you could look at terrestrial targets, possibly, especially if you have a scope that's well appointed for that. If you want to go bird watching or sightseeing, you will probably look at the moon and the planets. You'll probably be interested in looking at double stars and binary stars. Those are really cool. But we find that the thing that keeps people in this hobby, the thing that people are, coming up here to look at or to image, is deep sky objects. So deep sky objects are galaxies, nebulas, star clusters, globular clusters, and open clusters, which I don't have time to explain, and many other types of objects, many of which that well, I don't think you can see them tonight, but that you could see from our telescopes when it's not so cloudy and raining. So this is a map of the sky showing the Messier objects. So the Messier catalog has 110 objects, might be 109 depending how. There's some controversial objects in there that some people believe are duplicates. But so as you can see, this sort of covers the whole sky. So this catalog can basically keep you busy all year, since, as you may know, we only see certain parts of the sky depending on what time of year it is. And basically every telescope we've talked about tonight can see basically all of the Messier objects depending on, your like light pollution and atmospheric conditions and whatnot. But certainly all of them can see most of the Messier objects. You will notice that there is a blue thing making a big sort of oxbow shape. That is the Milky Way. So that is the plane of our own galaxy. In this diagram, or in this chart, yellow objects are star clusters, green objects are nebulas, and red objects are galaxies. And there's one called a dark nebula. All right, yeah, I know what that is, but I don't know if I would agree calling it a dark nebula. All right, so you'll notice that the star clusters kind of tend to cluster more along the plane of the Milky Way, while the galaxies are a little bit more out of it. That's because when you're looking into the plane of the galaxy, there's a lot of gas and dust and things that get in the way, make it hard for us to see galaxies beyond it. And right now, we're getting into what we call galaxy season, which is when this sort of cluster of red here that is in the constellation Virgo in the middle of the chart tends to become visible. So if you're a big fan of galaxies, this is a good time to be stargazing through the spring. In the summer, we'll be doing more stuff on the left-hand side of the chart here in the Cygnus constellation and down in Sagittarius. This big cluster of yellow stuff in Sagittarius, that is near to the center of our galaxy. So that's where you see a lot of like star clusters and stuff. That's why it's a very busy constellation. I've had nights up here where I started looking like the first object I looked at in Sagittarius. I looked at my watch. It was like 1 a.m, and then I finally finished all of the stuff I wanted to look at in Sagittarius. I looked at my watch and it was 3 a.m. So that's a busy constellation. All right, so now let's talk about expectations. We're used to seeing these beautiful astrophotos like what I showed at the beginning of the talk of Andromeda, but when you look through the eyepiece, you see something that looks a little bit more like what's on the right. So this is also Andromeda, and by the way, the thing on the right here is actually a sketch. People used to do that for most of the history of astronomy. The main way that people would record what they saw through a telescope was by sketching it. And there are still people that do that. That's something that you can do if you are so inclined. So why is there this discrepancy? Why does the astrophoto look so much better than what we see through the telescope? Well, there's a few reasons for that. The human eye is not well equipped to detect color at low levels of light. So basically everything that you're seeing through the telescope is going to be some shades of gray. This image, I don't know who took this picture, but it is likely that this image was taken over several hours of exposures, possibly several nights, and there may have been some post-processing, stacking of images, and there may have been some work in Photoshop to make this image. So, hmm? Yeah, maybe a lot of Photoshop. Now, this is nothing against astrophotography. I think this is super cool. I'm trying to get into imaging myself, but it is a little bit of it is a little bit of a different beast. So, when I think about why we do this, I'm dating myself with my references, which you're gonna see a lot when I'm doing talks. But I come back to that one Star Trek movie where Captain Kirk is climbing the mountain, with his bare hand with no safety equipment, and Mr. Spock comes up behind him riding a jetpack, and he starts saying, Captain, this is illogical. It's not possible for you to beat the fastest time that everyone's ever free ascended El Capitan, whatever, and because that was set in 2063 and whatnot. And Captain Kirk turns around and says to Spock that the reason we climb a mountain is because it's there. There's something I find very visceral or very, sort of, I guess spooky might be the word for it, about, looking through the eyepiece and seeing this object that, say with Andromeda, as 2.5 million light years away. So, when that light left that galaxy, human beings didn't exist on Earth. And in the time that that light was traveling through the void of space, human civilization started. The Egyptians built the pyramids. The Indus civilization built Mohenjo-Daro. The Chinese built the Great Wall. The Soviets built the Berlin Wall. A couple of those things came down. All 5 seasons of Breaking Bad came out, and then finally at the end of that optical train or continuous optical train, that photon hits your eye, and no one in this world could have predicted that particular photon was going to go into your eye. And so, there's other things about it. I like getting out in nature. I like spending that time outdoors. I like the friends I've made along the way. So, there's a lot to it. Okay, so some more tips. Find a dark area. You are currently at one if you're here on site at the Jenny Jump Observatory. Don't try to observe through the window of your Manhattan apartment. You will not see much. Okay, so this is a real anecdote. This actually happened to me. So I was at an astronomy event in Manhattan, and this couple came up to me, and one of them said, "Oh, I bought my partner a telescope for Christmas, and we couldn't get it to work. We couldn't see anything." I said, "Oh, well, what'd you try? What'd you do with it?" And the person said, "Oh, well, we pointed it at the skylight at the top of the apartment and tried to look at the stars through the window." And I was like, "Oh my god." You're spending, maybe not a whole hell of a lot of money, but you're spending this money on these optics of this, the lens of this telescope that is very finely made, has, coatings on it to increase light transmission, and now you're going to point it directly at a dingy Manhattan window. Of course you're not going to see anything. So you want to allow about 30 to 60 minutes for your gear to cool down. So telescopes will provide their best views when the air in the tube and the mirror are the same temperature as the outside air. So you want to give them some time to cool or potentially warm up. Though I find that it's usually always cooling. Even in the summertime, they do need to cool down because it gets colder at night. And if you don't do this, you'll get some swirliness in the image. And you want to allow about 30 to 60 minutes as well for your eyes to adjust for night vision. So you want to try not to look at any bright lights. Yes, including your phone. I know when you're observing. And so, you can put on a podcast. It'll be fine. You can use a red flashlight, or you can use glow sticks to find your way around in the dark. And actually, human beings see a lot better in the dark than we think we do. We live in a very brightly lit society, but if you spend some time outside in the dark, eventually you realize you see things pretty okay. And the rising heat from buildings is another thing that's going to mess up your view. So if you are in your backyard or somewhere near other buildings, you want to try to look at things that is not directly in a line that goes over the top of your house or your neighbor's house or something. And if you wear glasses, so you might want to just take your glasses off and just adjust the focus of the telescope to whatever your prescription is. This will work unless you have astigmatism. Astigmatism can't really be helped here. You basically need to keep your glasses on. I wear contact lenses. I have astigmatism in my left eye, so I do most of my observing with my right eye, and I usually keep my contacts on. And maybe at the end of the night, I'll run inside, take them off, and switch to glasses for my drive home. Um, and you want to have a plan. You want to go out with, an idea of what you're going to be looking at, or at the very least, bring a book, bring a field guide or something to get yourself some ideas, while you're out there. One additional tip: this hobby can really fill up your car. So this is my car packed for cellophane last year. And let's just go over a little bit of what's in here. So you see on the top right, you can see I have a one of those awnings that hooks onto the crossbars. So I had a little front porch area. This is two telescopes. This is my 6-inch and my 8-inch. That's a spare tire over there. A couple of chairs, a bed, a tent, an eyepiece case, a table, a pillow. Yeah, okay, maybe I overpacked a little bit. But this was for a 5-night camping and astronomy convention up in Vermont. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you not to buy a telescope. At least, not yet. Take your time. You're already here at Jenny Jump, if you're here at Jenny Jump. And you can get to see a lot of really great telescopes here for free. By the way, donations are accepted. And you can spend some time looking through them, get an idea of what you want. And if it were not rainy and cloudy, I would tell you. So for anyone out there, who's going to come back when we have a nicer night, or anyone watching the live stream who's going to come up here when we have a nicer night, I would encourage you to visit multiple of our telescopes here at Jenny Jump and boss us around to say, hey, that guy over there showed me, M13. I want to see what it looks like in this telescope. Or, that person over there showed me, I don't know, Andromeda. I want to see what it looks like in this telescope. Because if you look at the same object through different optical instruments, you can get an idea of what the instrument is bringing to the table. Your local library might have a telescope loaner program. These are usually those Orion Star Blast 4.5s. You basically can check out a telescope like a book. You should also join your local astronomy club. See, I told you I was going to come back. They also might have a telescope loaner program. There is talk of starting a telescope loaner program here at UACNJ. And my club, AAA, which is the New York club, we have a telescope loaner program as well. You also might want to get started with binoculars. I've never really done a lot of stuff with binocular astronomy, so it didn't make it that much into this talk. But if you're looking at the prices of the telescopes I'm recommending and you're saying, oh, geez, this is just not the amount of money I'm willing to commit to this, I would say rather than going out and finding a $50 telescope, I think that money is better spent on a good pair of binoculars. Because at that price point, the telescopes that are available are basically what we call department store grade, and they're not very good. Look around for used telescopes. As I alluded to earlier, telescopes are really sturdy. You can often find them easy to resell. Telescopes tend to outlive us. A lot of telescopes that you'll see at astronomy clubs are donated by members who are no longer with us. But you can also often get a good deal. You can find some deals on astromart.com or cloudynights.com. I love cloudynights.com. I always say that the reason it's called cloudynights.com, other than the joke that like being an astronomer means experiencing a lot of cloudy nights, is that whenever I'm experiencing a cloudy night, that's what I do. I'm like, all right, well, I wanted to feel like I did some astronomy, so I'm going to go on cloudy nights and see if anybody's selling some gear I want. Then I feel like I did something, And your local astronomy club very likely has someone who's trying to offload some excess gear. There are telescopes floating around this observatory that I've heard, tell of, oh, this might be coming up for sale at some point in the future that either belong to members here or that belong to a particular club here. Before we do that, I also want to mention another really great option to find used telescopes is at trade shows and swap meets. So, for instance, one of those is the Northeast Astronomy Forum, which Kim mentioned before. That's where a lot of us just came from, including me. I think part of the reason I was able to get this speaking slot is because most of us wanted to be there, and a lot of folks want to go straight home afterwards. You can find some really great deals at places like the Northeast Astronomy Forum or other, swap meets and whatnot. And it's also tomorrow. So if you really want to rush out to Rockland County and see if you can find a diamond in the rough, it's gonna be there tomorrow, and you might see me, and the rest of us. So yeah, just gonna repeat one more time. The best telescope is the one that gets used. And next week, our club president Paul will be presenting his talk. I bought a telescope. Now what? So if you don't follow my advice and you instead run out and buy a telescope between now and then, you can come up here and he'll tell you what to do with it.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan, for a great talk. Thank you for everyone who's joined us both here and also online. So, we are going to get into a question and answer session. First things first. Again, check out our website, uacnj.org. You'll find all sorts of fun information, including the talks, just in case you're like me and you're like, what's that date? When was that talk I wanted to see? That information is all there. You can also follow us on our socials, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Our Discord channel is great if you want to post uh, your space photos, if you want to ask questions about any equipment. And as always, we are a nonprofit, so all your support, what even if it's just coming in and viewing and pressing that like button or the follow button, helps us immensely to let us know we are doing a good job and keep this program running. With that, we are going to get into the question and answer session. And the first question of the night was something that disappeared. The first question was, if you have multiple eyepieces, which should you be using to find objects to start with?
Oh, that's a great question. So generally speaking, whatever eyepiece you have that is the highest number focal length. So for me, it's a 40 millimeter. I would say that's probably fairly typical. Maybe you might be something in like the 30s. Whatever's your highest number, that's going to be your widest field, and that's what you want to put in the telescope first. And a lot of the time, you will find that the object you found looks just great. You don't need to change out. If you're looking at something that's a little bit smaller, you might want to put in a smaller field eye or a higher magnification eyepiece. Though that's somewhat of a matter for taste. There are some people who actually like to see a lot of the background, and there's some objects that I really like seeing a lot of the background. Others I want to see just the object.
So basically, what you're saying is the larger the number, the more stuff is in that field of view,
Yes.
and then slowly work your way down the numbers to something you're happy with.
Yeah, and if you'll know when you've gone too far because you'll be seeing more blur, and you basically be seeing the instead of looking at Jupiter or the Andromeda galaxy, you're looking at the waves in the upper atmosphere that are disrupting your vision.
Any questions in our audience who is here?
Great talk. Secondly, you spoke in the beginning of the presentation a lot about aberration. What is aberration?
Oh yeah, so aberration, generally speaking, is when the image is messed up. So the first one we talked about was chromatic aberration. That's where you get. That's what I talked about with on the slide talking about apochromats versus achromats. So that's when the colors are wrong. A spherical aberration, which is another type of aberration, you tend to see when the focal ratio is really low. So that's when you have what we call a fast telescope. And I talked about that relative to reflectors and or particularly relative to reflectors. When you have spherical aberration, you get kind of like a 3D sort of a feeling of like the image looks more like a sphere. And the particular thing that you're seeing a lot of spherical aberration is when the stars at the edge of the field of view start to look like little comets that are kind of or like this teardrop shape. So when you're seeing that, that means that you need what's called a coma corrector, which is just a piece that goes under the eyepiece that will take away a bit of that spherical aberration.
All right. Excellent question. Now, the next question is you had mentioned consumer grade telescopes, which implies there are commercial or professional grade telescopes.
There are.
What is the difference besides just price?
Well, yeah. So the first difference is gonna be price. When you go beyond the consumer grade to, I guess I don't know if I would say professional grade, but higher end, maybe is a good term. You're gonna see a lot higher prices. You're gonna see things that are made rather than so the way that you're the mirrors and the reflector you're gonna buy from Woodland Hills or I didn't mention them before, but like from any sort of like High Point Scientific, B&H in New York City, the off the shelf telescopes, those are ground by machines. Those are robotically ground mirrors. When you get a higher end telescope, you're gonna get a mirror that was ground by hand, by a human being who is a master of the craft. And you're not going to get that mirror until that person is satisfied. Ooh, my screen locked. But you're not going to get that mirror until that person is satisfied that it is of the quality that they're looking for. You can all look at my lock screen. It's fine. The that you're expecting. A lot of those higher end telescopes, the mirror will arrive separately from the telescope because the company that makes the mirror and the company that makes the telescope might not be the same in the same place. And the wait time is going to be significantly longer. You maybe will put in your order and expect to see a telescope in like 8 to 10 months because they're basically people operating out of their barn. You will also will sometimes see like they'll have a 20-inch. By the way, I don't think that anyone should buy one of these things as their first telescope. I hope that's clear. But maybe you'll see like a 20-inch and like a 22-inch that they make, and then they'll list a 30-inch or something big like that, and it doesn't have a price. And the reason for that is because you basically have to call them and say, hey, do you guys have time to make a mirror this big? Which a lot of the time they might say, no, I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait.
All right. Was there another question out here? All right. So the next question from our online audience, and I think it's actually one you had answered, was was there a specific reason or reasons you suggested the Orion brand?
Yeah, so I would say that Orion is so I'm in no way brand loyal to Orion, and actually I included in my bonus slides, and yeah, I made bonus slides. This is a thing I picked up from academia. So people, this is anticipating possible questions. So Orion, I would say, is generally good on sort of entry level products. Celestron also makes a lot of good entry level products, but I think their sort of target audience is more on the mid price, based on the SCTs that they put out. Mead is a company that I think is usually associated with a higher standard of quality or a higher level of price, but they also make some beginner stuff. If you're interested in Dobsonian specifically, because they have a lot of manufacturers, Apertura, Explore Scientific, and Skywatcher also make Dobs that are, let's face it, probably from the same factory as the Orion ones. And I believe Explore Scientific has been putting out some more kind of higher end Dobsonians that maybe are a little bit higher price, but you'll get some better materials and some nicer stuff. I have no particular brand loyalty to Orion. Most of the telescopes I own are actually Celestrons, but I do think that they tend to deliver a good beginner product.
All right. Also, if anyone ever has a question, just hand up and wave it about. And when I get to you, keep your hand waving because, as he noted, staring at your phone screen or a computer screen makes you kind of night blind. So I kind of wander around the rest of the night going, I can't see anything.
Yeah, I can barely see anything outside of here.
But the next question uh, was actually more of a statement. So when you had mentioned the Celestron Star Sense, would you equate the Star Sense to almost having some training wheels on a bike, and eventually you grow out of those training wheels?
I think that's a fair sort of explanation. I would not, but I wouldn't say that it's bad necessarily to keep using the star sense system, because it does add a few things to the experience. It will give you some more information about the object you're looking at, which is displayed on your phone screen. I tend to use field guides for this, so I'll bring some, because like I cannot remember hundreds of objects, what the distance is, what the size is, and who discovered them, or other things I might be interested in learning, at the same time that I'm looking at them. So you could think of it like training wheels, but I wouldn't want to knock anybody who really liked it for using it.
Like I said, not necessarily knocking it, but it was,
Yeah, it's one. It's a
it
good way to
sounded like
it's a good way
a
to
thought
think of
that was like,
it. Yeah.
huh. Because I think you had mentioned some
Yeah.
people grow out of it.
Yeah, I've seen that happen.
So I'm going to put out a last call for any questions. And because there is a slight time delay from the people online hearing me, and, when they actually can get those questions in, like I said, Dan mentioned, you can see, come out if you happen to be attending NEAF. Come check us out at our booth. We are, in fact, there with information on our club, including a dark sky map of where we are in New Jersey.
Mm.
And we also have, like he mentioned, we do have some scopes that people have donated, and rather than have them rot away in an attic or, God forbid, end up in a landfill, since these are quite usable and serviceable scopes oftentimes, we do try and find them new homes. And like I said, we are a nonprofit, so all of those funds then go to help upkeep with the grounds, refurbishing current scopes, upgrading equipment, and so on.
And
So
also, if you come to NEAF and you find me and tell me that you were watching the talk online last night, then that will really freak me out, and I'll think that's really cool. Oh, I'll be all over the place, but likely at the AAA booth, because we have a booth up there as well. And also probably hunting for deals, though I found a lot of cool stuff today. Um, it's at 10 a.m. is the start time for Sunday.
yes,
I think they're open till 5.
the
Yeah.
the general public is 10 a.m. start time. I forget the close time.
I think it's 5. I'm pretty sure it's 5.
Oh yeah, 5
It
actually
might
sounds
be 4, but either way, if
5 sounds correct though.
if it's 5 p.m. and you still want to hang out and talk about astronomy, like, I'm sure you'll find someone to hang out with.
There's usually, you go there, you make friends. A lot of people go out to dinner afterwards because at 5, that's generally dinner time.
Yeah. People asked me where I was going for dinner after, but I had to tell them I had to be here.
But it looks like we are. Were there any last minute questions out here? All right, so it looks like we have used up those questions. If you ever think of any question, you can email us, or just add them onto the video. I do review questions added on in comments because we save our videos on YouTube. And until then, have a good night.
Clear skies.